There we go. I'd like to welcome everybody to another RPLC Partner Network webinar series. My name is Michael Blatherwick. I work here as Liaison Officer with the RPLC. Today's webinar is Centralized and Decentralized Police Systems, Examining Citizen Trust. And just a couple of housekeeping things to go over. The presentation, actually I can't remember how long the presentation is. How long is your presentation, Grichawat?
Will be like 40 minutes.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah.
And after the presentation, we'll open the floor to question and answers. If you could please use the Q&A box, which is in the bottom of the toolbar of the Zoom application, and type your questions. And Judy Stallman will go through those questions and ask them to Grichawat, and he will answer them for you. So I look forward to the presentation. Today's presentation will be recorded. And so the video will be posted up on our YouTube site. So if you're interested in watching it later or sharing it with your friends, we encourage that. And also we do have a copy of Grichawat's PowerPoint presentation, so you can look at it at your own leisure on your own time. Because this is a web-based program, sometimes we do, technology is a fun thing. Sometimes if the presentation stops abruptly, or if you have any problem with your audio, just hold on, because usually if there is an interruption, it usually lasts only about 30 seconds or a minute. It hasn't happened in the last 2 webinars, but I have had it happen before, and the program usually relaunches for you. If it doesn't, feel free to go back to zoom.us and reload or type in the same ID number to get back into the room. But like I said, even if you have problems with your computer, we are recording it, so if there's anything that's missed, there's also the ability to kind of go back and see what you would have missed. So with that, I'll pass it over to our host, who is Judy Stallman from the University of Missouri, and she'll introduce our speaker.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. I know it is spring break for many people, so I'm happy to have whoever we can on board. I'm really happy today to present Grichawat Lowatcharin. He will be receiving his Ph.D. from the University of Missouri Truman School of Public Affairs in May. I will tell you he has already successfully defended his dissertation, and I believe he has actually turned it in to the graduate school.
It is.
So all he's missing is the diploma. Grichawat is from Thailand, where they are in the process of decentralizing government from a unitary government to a government with 3 tiers. And when you're doing something like that, there are always the questions of what are the functions, responsibilities, powers, sort of, for lack of a better word, best decentralized, and which are best provided at more centralized levels. So he asked the question, and this is a big question in Thailand, decentralization of police. When he came to me with the question, it was a very good question. I also knew it was one of these big questions of how do you get your hands around it. I am highly impressed with the ideas that he came up with for how to do that, the frameworks he developed, and of course the interesting results that he has come up with. So I will now turn it over to Grichawat.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. So now I'm sharing my presentation. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I need to swap it. Yeah. Okay.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming again. Today, I'm going to talk about decentralization. It is part of my dissertation and a paper that I've been working with Dr. Judy Stallman. My main focus is on decentralization, as Dr. Stallman has talked about. And I'm interested in decentralization of police services because it is an important policy issue in Thailand and also in many countries around the world. So By decentralization, I mean the transfer of power, authority, and public services from a higher level of government to a lower level of government. And this is vertical decentralization. And since the late 1970s, early 1980s, international organizations such as the World Bank, the IMF have promoted and assisted in decentralization reforms in countries around the world, especially in developing countries, for example, Thailand. And the focus of my study is on vertical decentralization and of the general purpose police. And by general purpose police, I mean the police officer with full powers to access, arrest, and investigation for any criminal offense throughout the territory of the authorizing government unit. So I'm not talking about special purpose police like airport or tax police, something like that. So I'm going to give you a bit a background about policing in Thailand. The Thai police were ranked the least honest public institution in a survey in 2000, and more than a decade later, in 2013, it was ranked the highest level of corruption. And this is an excerpt from a comic book in Thailand depicting a Thai police officer as an evil one, and he is very good at capturing scapegoats. So this is an illustration, a depiction of the dissatisfaction of Thai citizens toward the police. So in the past 80 years, there were two major reforms in terms of the structural reforms of the Thai police. The first one was in 1933, after the democratic revolution that put an end to the absolute monarchy. And at the time, the government, the newly established democratic government, integrated various police agencies at the time into one big department of the police under the Ministry of Interior. And they used that structure for many decades until the second major reform in the late 1990s and early 2000. And at the time, the Royal Thai Police, RTP, was transferred from the Ministry of Interior to be directly under the office of the Prime Minister. However, the structure of the Thai police has remained highly centralized. And as I mentioned before, Thailand started decentralizing powers, authority, and public services from the national government to local levels of government since the late 1990s. And so far, 238 public goods and services have been decentralized, and none of which has something to do with police services. And the structure of the Royal Thai Police remains highly centralized. And there are many problems facing the Royal Thai Police. And in recent years, there have been calls from civil society sectors and studies and interest groups. They call for reforms, and what they share in common among these groups is the concept, the idea about decentralization of police services from the national government to the local governments. And Thailand is not alone in this policy issue. The issue of centralization, decentralization of police services is a common policy issue for countries around the world. For example, in Brazil, they have changed their police system from a centralized to a decentralized one since the early 1980s, and Mexico too. And Mexico is now considering a move from a more decentralized to a less decentralized or more centralized. And the Philippines has transferred some political authority and power relating to the police services to local governments in the 1990s. And South Korea, like Thailand, South Korea is considering a move from centralized to a more decentralized system. The problem with this is that the literature does not provide concrete empirical evidence. There is a gap in empirical research of the effects of police systems, decentralization of police services on police services, police performance and outcomes. So the subfield of police system started in the 1980s and early 1990s, and at the time it was relatively new. There were some descriptive case studies, but there were very few comparative studies across countries. And Bailey, who is one of the big names in the subfield, called for more comparative, generalizable empirical studies of the effects of police system on police performance and outcomes. About 30 years later, the situation hasn't changed as much because even though there are more studies of police system nowadays, most of them are descriptive in nature, and there is, in the literature, there is a lack of a standardized typology of police systems. And because of this lack, it is difficult to conduct an empirical comparative study of the effects of police system on police performance. So, and also the literature also has also found some interesting findings about decentralization in more and less developed countries between the industrialized world and in developing countries. Decentralization has stronger historical roots in developed countries, especially in the West, than in developing countries. And decentralization in most developing countries began in the late 1970s or later, like Thailand. But in Western industrialized countries, decentralization has always been there over the past 100 years. And the literature has also found differences between the more developed and the less developed countries. And these differences have something to do with the success or failure of decentralization policy. For example, there are differences in terms of technological accumulation and production capacity, differences in terms of human capital, governance capacity, and especially there are differences in terms of the administration of police services. And as you may be aware that in developing countries, police officers are poorly paid and are poorly equipped. They have limited resources for performing their duties. So this is interesting to see how decentralization of police services affects police outcomes in developing and developed countries. So my objective for the current studies are threefold. First, I'm going to develop a typology of police systems based on the theories and concepts of new institutionalism, decentralization, and fiscal federalism. And the second objective is to examine the effect of police system on police citizen trust in the police via empirical analysis of 72 countries. There's a typo there. And the third one is to examine the effects of police system on citizen trust in the police and in the more and less developed countries. So to come up with a new typology, I'm looking at the theory of decentralization and the theory of decentralization, which is related to public goods and services, talks about three types or three forms of decentralization. The first one is administrative decentralization. This is about the transfer of managerial supervisory responsibility, for example, planning, management, resource allocation, from a higher level of government to lower levels of government. Remember, this is vertical decentralization. And the second form is political decentralization, or someone would call this is a devolution. It is about the transfer of decentralized decision-making authority from the higher level of government to lower level of government, or to the citizens at the locality for them to be able to vote to pick their local government. And the last form, the third form, is the fiscal decentralization, and this is mainly about the transfer of authority for revenue generation, allocation, and expenditure for the provision of public goods and services. So these three forms of decentralization provide me a framework to construct, to develop a new typology of police decentralization. And I have come up with a new typology of police services called the Police Decentralization Index, or PDI, and it measures the varying degrees of police decentralization within a given country. And it is based on the following components relative to the three forms of decentralization. The first component is the number of tiers of government. And the second component is the number of tiers of government with political or administrative control over the police. And the third one is the number of tiers of government with fiscal control over the police. However, there is an issue in the literature. The literature does not provide adequate information about the last component. They don't talk much about who pay for the police so what I'm trying to say is that there is a lack of information for the third component. So I was forced by the lack of the information to drop the third component. And the final PDI in the current study is calculated by dividing the second component by the first component, and the tiers of government with political control over the police by the total tiers of government, and you get a PDI from that. For example, in the United States, they have 4 tiers of government. There is a federal government, there are state governments, counties, and municipalities, and all of which have some sort of general purpose police. And when you divide it 4 by 4, you get a PDI score of 1. Another example from my home country of Thailand, we have 3 tiers of government. We have the national government at the highest level. In the second tier, we have the PAOs, or the provincial administrative organizations, and the lowest tier is the municipalities. However, only the national government has the power and authority to provide police services throughout the kingdom, throughout the country. And when you divide it 1 by 3, you get a PDI score of 0.33. And to give a more illustrative example, I'm showing you the case of Canada. Canada have 5 tiers of government, and this varies from province to province. So, and out of the 5 tiers of government, only 4 have some sort of general purpose police, and the PDI score for Canada is 5, 4 divided by 5, and you get a PDI score of 0.8. And I'm doing this for 72 countries around the world, and this map shows the varying degrees of police decentralization across the countries in 72 countries in my sample. Red, the color red means highly centralized, and blue means highly decentralized, and gray means no data. So, for example, the US is highly decentralized, and Russia, this red big one, is highly centralized. Russia has 4 tiers of government like the US, but only the federal government have political, administrative, and fiscal control over the police. And the map also shows you the less and more developed countries in the sample, and I'm going to talk about that later in my analysis. So now that I have an independent variable to examine the effects of police decentralization, I'm going to need a framework or some hypothesis to come up with to guide my analysis. So I'm looking at 3 theories to formulate my framework. The first one is new institutionalism. The second one is the theory of decentralization. And the third one is the theory of fiscal federalism. So new institutionalism argues that institutions provide information to individuals, and in return, institutions affect individuals' behavior and performance, because individuals have incomplete information, and they need to rely on information provided by institutions, whether it be culture, laws, and regulations, and environment. Decentralization, the theory of decentralization argues that decentralization is more responsive to citizen preferences and enhance accountability and responsiveness. And similarly, the theory of fiscal federalism argues that decentralized provision of public goods and services reviews citizen demand and preference, and therefore it enhances efficiency. So based on these three theories, I come up with a theoretical framework that is a move from a centralized police system to a decentralized police system is an institutional change that is hypothesized to lead to changes in behavior and performance of the police. So based on this framework, I come up with two hypotheses for this study. The first one is that in a decentralized police system, it is expected to have a higher level of citizen trust in the police, or a positive relationship between police decentralization index and percentage of citizen trust in the police. And that's for the 72 countries. That is the first hypothesis. The second hypothesis is that more developed countries will have higher level of citizen trust in the police than the less developed countries, because more developed countries have stronger historical roots in terms of decentralization, and they have better technology, governance system, managerial system, and human capital, and better administration of police services. So these are my hypotheses. To test the hypothesis, I'm using an unbalanced panel data of 72 countries. And from the year 2001 to 2012, and that's 12 years. And because it is unbalanced, the total observation for this study is 371 country years. And I'm using data from various sources. And for the variables, the dependent variable is the percentage of citizen trust in the police. And this is based on various opinion surveys available from online sources. And the independent variable, as I mentioned before, is the police decentralization index for 72 countries. And I'm also controlling for 5 sets of variables: the governance variable, environmental and organizational measures, socio-economic measures, demographic measures, and last one is the geographic measures. And my analysis is based on 3 statistical models, and I'm using one-way random effects here. The first model is focusing on the full sample of 72 countries. The second model is looking at the more developed countries, and the last one is looking at the less developed countries. And I'm dividing, separating the more and less developed countries by looking at the Human Development Index. If it is higher than 0.8, it has a very high human development based on the United Nations, and lower than 0.8 becomes the less developed country. And as you can see here on this graph, the cut-off point is relatively closer to the the top of the peak of the normal distribution curve. And so at the end, I'm getting a set of 74 more developed countries and 48 less developed countries. And just so you know, this is based on the Human Development Index for the year 2000. And because the more developed countries have more survey information about citizen trust than the less developed, the number of observations between the two groups are relatively the same. And here are some descriptive statistics. And in terms of the dependent variables, as you can see here, the percentage of citizen trust in the police varies a lot. You get it ranges from 12% of citizens who have trust in the police to 91%. And in terms of police decentralization index, it ranges from 0.25, this is Russia and New Zealand, to 0.1, for example, the US. And also having a very good sample here. There are a lot of variance in terms of the control variables. For example, in terms of corruption perception index, it ranges from 1.7 in Bangladesh, and to 9.7 in Sweden or Finland. And also some other control variable have very a good range. So here are the key findings of the effects of police decentralization index on citizen trust. In the first model of 72 sample countries, it is not significant. The relationship between citizen trust and police decentralization is not significant in the full sample. And this is rejecting the first hypothesis. But when we look at the more and less developed countries, we have some differences here. And in the more developed countries, the police decentralization index has a positive relationship with citizen trust. On the other hand, in the less developed country, the police decentralization index has an inverse relationship with citizen trust, and the two findings support the second hypothesis, and it is totally opposite direction. Not just that more developed countries have higher level of trust. So, and in the literature, they have found mixed effect of decentralization on trust. For example, Ostrom and Parks in the 1970 found positive relationship. Espasa in 2012 found an inverse relationship, and Morris recently found no significant relationship. So I have found some mixed finding of the effects of police decentralization on citizen trust here. And the findings here between more and less developed countries also support the previous research that there are differences between more and less developed countries in terms of administration of police services, and this may have some role in the in citizen trust in decentralized police systems. And now we're looking at the full findings from my analysis. As you can see here, other control variables also play important roles in terms of citizen trust. They have also have varying effects on trust. For example, democracy in general for the 72 countries has an inverse relationship with trust. But when we look at more developed countries, the relationship is positive, but it is negative in the less developed countries. And corruption perception index has positive relationship with trust. I should note that the CPI, or the corruption perception index, is coded in such a way that the higher numbers are good. A higher number denotes a more transparent and less corruption, and lower number denotes a higher degree of corruption. So higher is good, lower is bad, and the corruption perception index has a positive relationship with citizen trust in the full sample and in the less developed countries, but not in the more developed countries. And interestingly, the number of police officers per 100,000 citizen inhabitants has inverse or negative relationship with trust in all the three models. So the more the number of the police officers, the lower the citizen trust in the police. And it's also very interesting findings here that armed police officers have inverse relationship with citizen trust in the more developed countries, but not in the less developed country. And one of the most important control variable is the GDP per capita income. Richer countries tend to have more trust in the police, and this is true for the more developed and also the less developed countries. So based on these findings, I come up with some policy implications for countries around the world to deal with their police decentralization, police services. For more developed countries, the transferring of police services to local governments may increase citizen trust in the police. This is for more developed countries. And for less developed countries, decentralization itself does not improve citizen trust in the police. If they are planning to transfer police services or to decentralize police services to local governments, they need to improve managerial systems, human resources, and technological capacity, governance capacity, things like that, for decentralization to work, to gain citizen trust. And for my future research, I'm interested in in-depth comparative case studies of countries that have changed their police systems, like Brazil, the Philippines, and Venezuela. And also I'm interested in adapting or applying an index such as the PEI to study decentralization of other public services, for example, healthcare and education. And that's it. Thank you so much. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Okay.
At the moment, I do not see any questions.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions?
I'll ask a question, if that's okay, Judy.
Mm-hmm.
And because I have a microphone, I can just talk. You mentioned future research. Are there any areas or specifics to where you think you'd like to do research?
You mean for the same? Yeah, I'm gonna need. What I'm interested in is to see how a change in terms of police system from either a centralized to decentralized or vice versa affect police performance and citizen trust and police outcomes. Yes, I mentioned before, the Philippines has decentralized their power relating to police services to local governments in the 1990s, and because the Philippines is closer to Thailand and similar to Thailand in terms of political history and in terms of human development, it would be interesting to see how does decentralization work in the Philippines, and to come up with some policy implication for Thailand. And yeah, I have also talked to one of my friends who is studying education here in the University of Missouri, and he is also interested in the effects of decentralization of education services, because now in Thailand we have also a centralized educational system. The national government controls all the teachers in the country. So it would be also interesting to apply my index or to come up with similar index, examine the effects of decentralization of education for countries around the world.
Okay, we have a question in the chat box from Kathleen.
Okay.
And she's asking, what can trust do to other benefits for society? She goes on to say, this is great work. You have made some compelling arguments. What might be done also from the grassroots, perhaps harnessing social capital to strengthen trust? So there's basically sort of two very closely related questions. What can trust do to other benefits for society, and what can be done from the grassroots level, perhaps using social capital to increase trust?
Yes, as you can see here in the finding that to increase trust in the police or in the government in general, it is important for the government to be more transparent, to be less corrupt, and that would increase trust in the police, and citizens have roles in encouraging or promoting the concept of transparency, or have roles in to push the government to be more transparent, and that would affect the level of trust. And in return, if you I think have more trust in the police, and that would make it easier to, increase the relationship between police officers and citizens, and would be more beneficial. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question.
Can I step in, Grichawat?
Yes.
I think, part of the issue is what you have pointed to. If there are high levels of corruption, then there really is no good reason for citizens to trust police, and so you do need to the part of it falls on the police. But the other side of the question then is how can they need to work on corruption? What other things could police do that would help them, perhaps in addition to lowering corruption, to increase citizen trust in them?
The police. Okay. I think the police need to be more. So we in the research they have been talking about the concept of community policing and the concept of representative bureaucracy. I think one thing to increase citizen trust is to organize the police structure or services based on the the thing is to make police officers who serve the area locality look like people in the locality, to be representative of local citizens, and that is a way to increase trust and legitimacy of the police. And one thing, interesting thing is that to see further is that if people have more trust in the police, would they need lower police officer to serve their locality? And that would be an interesting research question.
Okay. Here's another question, Grichawat, from Sylvia. She thanks you because she found it very interesting. She makes the point that she was glad to see that you had defined development in terms of the Human Development Index, because often, of course, it's defined simply in terms of GDP. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting to connect that to citizen trust and administrative models. She's also asking if you're hoping to present this in Tokyo at the upcoming HDCA conference. And Sylvia, I will admit I don't know what that HDCA stands for and the timing on that. So if you could send us a chat, we can look at that. But here's the question. In terms of thinking about rural areas in Canada, which are very different, of course, from Thailand, what could we hypothesize about the presence or absence of policing systems in depressed or booming rural economic areas?
So, what could we hypothesize about the presence of police services?
Presence or absence in the depressed, which would be equivalent to your lower in your low HDIs, or the booming, which it would be hard to tell whether they are low or high HDI.
Right. So I think police services per se are not directly related to economic development, but they serve as because they are law enforcement officers. They provide framework for citizens, for local business to behave and to enforce laws and regulations. And where there is an absence of good policing, there tend to be highly corrupt or bad business in general. So I think there's a role for police services there, but at the moment I could not come up with a hypothesis about it. I need to look at more on that. I mean, about the role of policing in generating economic development.
I think this is a really interesting question.
Yes.
It's an interesting variation on sort of what Grichawat had come up with. And so it would be interesting to, within one country, look at those depressed and booming rural economies to see which one it is. I'm like Grichawat, I'm not coming down on one side or the other in terms of hypothesis of what I would predict, particularly in those booming rural economies.
Right.
Other questions? Okay. Okay, so Sylvia replies, and this is a helpful, that she was thinking of the distrust of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the difficulties of imagining a better approach. So yeah, so she says, thank you for trying to.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yes, glad I can, yeah.
It's Michael here. I was actually kind of thinking of the same way as Sylvia, because even here in Manitoba, we had a number of municipalities that amalgamated, and in Manitoba here in Canada, municipalities have the ability to have their own police force, or they can pay for the RCMP to deliver those services. So they kind of have that choice of either developing their own municipal or to have RCMP. For many of our First Nation communities, they have RCMP. And your comment about that the police need to reflect the people in which they're governing, I'm thinking may be true, because that relationship between armed police and disadvantaged people, that they have more trust if they're armed, I think is negated by the fact that maybe that the visual makeup of the police that are policing them don't reflect the community in which they're monitoring. So that's probably part of it. But the other thing that I was wondering about the municipalities is the differences between with amalgamated, and this is really on a lower level, like on a municipal level, not necessarily on a national level, but that it's pretty complex when you have to choose between, if you have two communities that amalgamated and one had their own police force and one had RCMP, how would they be able to kind of measure what would be the best way to engage with their own community and to have a service that's effective and also that the people would trust. So yeah, it's very complicated. I agree with you that it'd be hard to hypothesize how that would work here in Canada. I do think as well that using the HDI index is really good, because like Sylvia and Judy said, that it's, GDP is not necessarily the only measure that we should evaluate community. Right. So,
and I will tell you that was completely Grichawat's idea. It was not, we can give him full credit for that.
Thank you.
If you look at the findings, we do have an ethnic heterogeneity variable in the findings, and it turns out that it was not statistically significant. But I think there is a difference between sort of measuring this at sort of the country level and then getting to the issue of, for example, First Nations or policing within ethnic regions of different parts of a country. And Grichawat alluded to this a little bit when he talked about some of the policy implications of perhaps having the police perhaps looking more like the people they are policing. I will say that you can find arguments in the literature on how alike, both for and against, that if they're too alike, they perhaps are more susceptible to corruption.
Right.
But on the other hand, if they are too different, that does engender quite a bit of distrust. And also, I think it has to do with history.
Mm-hmm. And that's true because, for example, in Mexico, they also have state police, federal police, and municipal police. And people in Mexico tend to have very, very low trust in the municipal police. And that's because they are, the municipal police are poorly armed, poorly equipped, and poorly paid. They are more corrupt. So local citizens don't trust them. And the other thing is that Mexico has very high prevalence of crimes and especially criminal gangs, criminal activities that cross jurisdiction. And municipal police are not as good as preventing or investigating crimes that cross jurisdictions. And yeah, what I'm trying to say is that the issue of decentralized and versus centralized is very complicated, and there are a lot more to work on.
Going back to the First Nations thing, I said there is history, so there is this history of whether the larger culture oppressed them or not, but there is also the whole issue of culture and whether the laws and such, as they are interpreted and enforced, conform to the First Nations cultural norms of what is fair and just. And so you may have the police acting in what the larger culture would suggest is a fair and just way, but it is possible that their cultural norms have different definitions. And so they may be viewed as unfair and unjust because the cultural norms are different.
Right.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you for the presentation.
Thank you very much. Yep.
Yeah, that was excellent, and excellent comments by Sylvia. I agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'll just make a comment that, of course, I'll remind everyone that this will be posted to our YouTube site, and to the participants who registered, I will email the link to that, along with a copy of, excuse me, Grichawat's presentation. Our next webinar is next week, actually. We have one, and I'll send out the details for that. And thanks again to our presenters, to Judy and Grichawat, for being speakers today. And I look forward to seeing everybody in the future. Thanks again.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Michael.